Unstoppable, a book by W.P. Thrift, read by name redacted, Chapter 5, Retrieving What's Valuable. The sleeping bag was well worn and flattened, providing virtually no padding between herself and the ground. The sheets were thin, almost as thin as the tent itself. Lucia had snuggled up to her in the night, and had likely slept far more soundly than Elizabeth herself had, as she had an entire body to hold herself against during the long, cold night. Elizabeth awoke at the first crack of sunlight piercing through the tent, which would have been a few hours after the actual sunrise. The mountains kept the immediate forest dark for many extra hours before the sun could rise high enough to cast its light over the trees, illuminating her makeshift campground. Her back ached, her bones groaned. She wasn't old yet, but she already felt the first threads of youth beginning to leave her, especially first thing in the morning when she was so sore and stiff. She was about to get up until she remembered the child was sleeping next to her, and she ended up freezing there in one spot, afraid to stir and wake her. While Elizabeth had ample practice wearing herself out, sleeping a few hours then bouncing back up to do it all again, this poor child was likely worn slap out from being awake for so long and ran ragged all throughout the castle yesterday. By all Elizabeth heard, this girl and her group were unable to sleep the entire time the wizard had them captured. She must have been running on fumes by the time they'd escaped the castle so late yesterday. Lucia finally stirred awake more than an hour later, and Elizabeth pretended to just be waking up too as Lucia yawned and sat up, bumping her head on one of the tent poles. It was a surprisingly small tent, designed to contain just one person and keep the bugs, wind and morning dew off while they slept. "Good morning, Liz," Lucia said, looking back and seeing Elizabeth starting to lean up onto her elbows. "Good morning, child. Shall we break camp? We have miles to go." Elizabeth didn't realize until after she said it that she'd posed this as a question rather than an order. As Lucia eagerly agreed and began to drag herself out of the tent, Elizabeth didn't have a moment to correct herself and restate her words more forcefully. She decided to let this slip-up go, and crawled out of the tent herself. While Lucia was looking around desperately for a place to run and pee, Elizabeth's eyes immediately locked onto the spot where the burlap sack should be. She sighed slightly, but didn't otherwise react. "John's gone, and the treasure." Lucia panicked, suddenly noticing this. "Did someone kidnap him and steal the treasure?" Elizabeth cracked a smile at that naive analysis. "No, child. John stole my treasures and fled with them in the night," Elizabeth said calmly. "But this is serious. You won't be able to pay off the debt on your home," Lucia panicked. "He can be easily tracked," Elizabeth replied, "so I'm not worried. Besides, there's still many more days in the month, and I always have backup belongings I can sell if all else fails." "Stored where? You're homeless, aren't you?" There was a home Elizabeth was technically squatting in. It had been foreclosed years ago due to being haunted. She'd vanquished the ghost without telling anyone, and took up residence in it herself. Nobody dared venture close enough to the house to see her living in it, and if any noises or lights were ever seen from the house, everyone would simply assume it was the ghost. It was the closest thing she had to a home. "There's a place where I keep my stuff," Elizabeth replied after a brief pause. "I'll be returning there for a couple days after I return you to your parents. Maybe you can stop by and say hi to me before I leave again." Lucia suddenly pouted, and looked away, feeling ashamed. Everyone kept calling her a noble. She was scared if she admitted to only wearing the dress of one that Elizabeth wouldn't like her anymore. "Liz has been so nice to me, I don't want to disappoint her," Lucia argued with herself. She realized Elizabeth was staring at her, expecting some kind of reply. I have to use the bathroom," Lucia said quickly, then ran off to find a place to squat. Elizabeth sighed again, and turned back towards her pile of armor. She began sliding everything back on and strapping it all back up, tying and tightening everything so it held firmly on her body. She threw her cape on last, pinned it down, and then placed a hand on the hilt of her sword. She closed her eyes and said a quick prayer to the god of war, as she did every morning since she began training as a knight. Opening her eyes again, she saw Lucia emerging from the woods. The girl sat on an old stump and watched Elizabeth take down the tent and put it away in its sack before tossing it to Lucia. "You get to carry the tent since my bag's missing. I trust carrying it and the chalice won't be too much for you?" Lucia smiled. "No, ma'am. You can count on me." "Good. Don't let me down. Our tent depends on you." They looked out at the forest and began walking, Lucia asking Elizabeth how she would be able to track John. The knight replied by rattling off the basics of animal tracking skills, such as looking for tracks or broken tree branches, listening for places where the birds were quiet, as that usually indicated a human was nearby in that area, and so forth, before adding a final note. "You can also see the huge indenture in the ground where he dragged the treasure sack behind him, because he was too weak to carry it. Not even 20 yards from the campsite, John had dropped the sack down and started dragging it. Elizabeth had seen this immediately this morning, and knew she'd only have to follow it to find her missing treasure hoard. They wandered through the woods for a surprising amount of time. Elizabeth had to admit to herself that she was impressed with just how much distance John had managed to travel in the dead of the night with a day and a half worth of exhaustion nipping at his heels. Lucia began whimpering from hunger around noon, or at least Elizabeth heard her stomach growling along with whimpers escaping from her mouth and assumed the two things were related. Lucia didn't say a word about it, being experienced being starved. Elizabeth was glad for that because she had no food to give. The rest of the jerky was left in the treasure sack which they were tracking. Once they found it, they could eat, and until then it would be a waste of time to stop and try and hunt down food. Berry bushes were rare in these parts, and evergreens aren't terribly edible without quite a bit of prep work. On the bright side, it was much warmer by noon, and all the crinks and pains of the morning had departed. Elizabeth felt alert and nimble again, and this feeling returned to her with perfect timing as a giant spider fell from the trees above to try and pounce upon her. Before she even got a good look at it, she sliced her sword upward in a fine arc that cleaved it straight in twain, its slimy ichors spewing out everywhere and further gunking up young Lucia's dress, while Elizabeth quickly rolled backwards to avoid being slimed. Standing up and getting a good look at the spider, she saw it had the appearance of a tarantula the size of a bear, and could have either been hiding up in the tree or have leapt at them from half a mile away. It looked easily strong enough to have made that leap. Lucia began to scream as the full realization of what had just occurred hit her, and Elizabeth shrieked loudly. Lucia began to panic and whimper to herself, not being a fan of giant spiders that try to kill her out of the blue. The young girl looked herself over, seeing the slimy blue and green goop that had splattered all over her, further ruining her dress to near the point of it being unrecognizable. This upset her more than some random monster trying to kill her at this point, as she still felt safe enough with Elizabeth nearby. However, another giant spider emerging from seemingly nowhere and throwing itself at her still made her scream from a sudden jolt of primordial fear. Elizabeth was in front of her in a heartbeat, slicing clean through the spider with her dazzling ornate sword, her cape bellowing in the wind behind her, and her expression utterly unmoving, completely stoic. "We need to run, hurry," Elizabeth told her. "Are they going to eat us?" Lucia was suddenly surprised. "What? No, they don't stand a chance against me. But they'll never stop coming until I hunt down and slay their queen, and the more I have to slay, the greater the chance I'll get spider guts on my nice shiny armor. Do you know how hard that is to wash out?" Lucia looked at her own dress and started to cry. She ran alongside Elizabeth, barely keeping her eyes open to stay focused on the path ahead of her. "Stop crying. I can wash your dress out at the next river we come to. Armor is way harder to wash." What? Really?" "Yes, it requires polish, which is expensive." "No, I mean, can you really wash my dress? Make it pretty again?" "Of course I can. How do you not know how to wash it? Have you been pampered your whole life or something?" Elizabeth was suddenly very curious about this. Lucia didn't act at all like a spoiled brat, yet she'd never learned the basics of washing clothes. Fact of the matter was, Lucia had never owned clothing worth washing before, going from tattered threads to tattered threads her whole life. But this was something there was no time for Elizabeth to discover now, as they came across a massive pit in the forest. Several 100 yards across and 100 yards deep at its center, a massive sunken crater in the woods stretched out before them, yet it was not brightly lit from the missing trees overhead, as the entire top of it, from one tree line to the next 100 yards away, had been webbed over. The treetops surrounding the pit supported the massive web, keeping the pit dark enough that the nighttime predators weren't exposed to too much light. "The queen's at the core of this nest. I have to move quickly, but—" Elizabeth glanced over at Lucia just in time to see another massive spider attack her. The knight charged forward and sliced another spider in half, then lopped several legs off another in a sloppy strike that left the arachnid alive. It hissed and began spitting venom at them, but Elizabeth grabbed Lucia and rolled with her out of the way, hurling a dagger hidden in the cuffs of her gauntlets straight into the side of the spider's head, piercing its brain, killing it. "Yeah, no, I can't leave you behind. You'll get eaten. Here, just climb onto my back." Elizabeth knelt down and prepared to give Lucia a piggyback ride into battle. "Are you sure?" Lucia gasped, but then saw at least a dozen more giant spiders rushing in at them. "Yes, I'm certain," Elizabeth said. "I run around with a giant sack of treasure on my back all the time. You weigh far less than it does." Lucia saw the world through Elizabeth's eyes as she jumped down into the hole and rushed along it at dizzying speeds, seemingly faster than humans could ever possibly hope to run, and running practically horizontally down some of the drops as she leapt and dodged and weaved between spiders, dodging their acid spit, and attempts to land on her and crush her with their bodies. She avoided their invisible web traps through learned intuition. She could tell where foliage growing in the pit folded in the wrong ways to indicate something was tugging on it, and she could slice through the invisible webs or leap over it, whatever was easier. Her body flowed like water, always through the path of least resistance, through the air, through the webs, or through the giant spiders themselves if she was forced to slice into them to make tracks into the pit. "How can you do this? How can anyone be so confident?" Lucia cried out, uncertain if her words were fearful or full of glee. Perhaps a mixture of both. She wished more than ever that she could someday grow up to be just like Elizabeth. "Confidence has nothing to do with it," Elizabeth replied. "What I do is purely based on skill alone." Skill, and the magical curse which makes me unstoppable, Elizabeth's mind reminded her. I cannot fail at anything I do. The oracle told me this, and since that day I've never failed at anything. She actually couldn't recall anything in particular she'd failed at before seeing the oracle. Besides her attempt to end her own life. He had said she was unkillable too, though. But she tried not to think too much about that one glaring contradiction, as paradoxes like that made her head hurt to consider. Landing in the center of the nest, staring down the biggest, ugliest spider of them all, Elizabeth recognized the twisted husk of a human laying amongst the dried, drained husks of other animals in the forest near the queen. The human's face was twisted in what was its final, truly terrifying moment as it was drained slowly of its fluids by the queen spider. Its face was also instantly recognizable to her. She just hoped that Lucia wouldn't notice. "Oh my gods, it's John!" Lucia cried out. "Damn it, so much for her not recognizing him," Elizabeth groaned. No time to deal with the further traumatized child now, though, as the giant queen began to smash its giant legs down towards her, trying to pin down and crush its prey. Elizabeth swung her sword at the spider several times, but its unnaturally massive size made it easily able to avoid getting sliced by moving far too far away. It was easily 10 times the size as every other spider here, towering over the night. Annoyed to have to use this little trinket, Elizabeth reached into one of the tiny pouches attached to her belt and drew out a tiny enchanted music box. She cranked it up between sudden pouncing attacks coming from the queen. More acid came in from all around her as all the other spiders began to catch up. They were surrounded, pinned down in what would ordinarily be considered a hopeless situation. But Elizabeth just kept winding the music box until the key would turn no further, so she let it go and the music box began to play a most eerie melody. All of the spiders stopped suddenly, surprised by the sound. "Cute music box," Lucia said, looking over Elizabeth's shoulder at it. A delicate porcelain princess in a flowing dress spun around on one foot. "Does its music soothe the savage beast?" "No," Elizabeth replied. "It shoots fire at them." The front of the music box erupted like a volcano and spewed a searing hot beam of fire straight into the queen spider with enough force to stun her on impact, sending her spiraling into the air and erupting her entire body into flames before she hit the ground again, setting the entire massive nest on fire. All of the spiders began to rush around, seeking deposits of water to suck up and then run over and spray the fire with. The spider firefighter brigade was doomed to fail and their entire nest would roast, but in the meantime they'd all completely ignored the intruder to their nest, who was now free to roam around and seek her belongings. "Over there!" Lucia tugged on Elizabeth's cloak, pointing over to the large burlap sack. The spiders had drug it down here with John's body when they went to feed the queen. Were the spiders intelligent enough to understand the value of the artifacts within that bag? They were smart enough to have a firefighter system, so it was entirely possible they were sentient creatures. Not that it mattered now, as Elizabeth had just torched their entire civilization. The knight ran over to grab her belongings, but froze when she realized throwing the sack on her back would squish Lucia. Lucia realized this too and rotated around to hold on to Elizabeth's front, hugging her around the neck so she'd have room to throw the bag on her back. Good enough," Elizabeth said, then hoisted the bag up, feeling the familiar weight of a near quarter-ton of treasures slamming into her spine before she began to race away from the beating heart of the massive burning pit in the forest. The spiders screamed and crackled behind her, and Lucia watched on with awe, looking back with her chin resting on Elizabeth's left shoulder the entire way out of the spider pit. She watched the pure chaos her hero had just caused, the countless lives that were just taken, all in the name of fetching her loot. This was a terrifying lesson to the young Lucia. It taught her that treasure was to be valued at all cost,